In the autumn of 1944, Martin Keller, a young German soldier, stepped off the transport train onto the wet, cold soil of Britain. He had been trained for one thing: brutality. For years he had lived with hatred drilled into his mind. He had been taught to expect the worst from the enemy. Propaganda had promised him torture, starvation, and abuse at the hands of the British. 4 years of fighting, death, and fear had prepared him for nothing else. And yet, nothing could prepare him for what he was about to face. As he looked around, the first thing he noticed was the absolute order. British soldiers stood in perfect formation, their uniforms clean and pressed despite the drizzle falling from the gray sky. There were no shouts, no strikes, no harsh words. The discipline was calm, quiet, almost unsettling. It reminded Keller uncomfortably of the standards he had once seen in Germany before the war had turned everything into chaos. He expected chaos here. He expected monsters. Instead, he saw something entirely different. A middle-aged sergeant approached the prisoners. His eyes were steady, his face unreadable, a man who had seen all the horrors the war could bring and remained unimpressed. He spoke slowly, his German heavily accented but clear. "You will form orderly lines. You will be searched for weapons. You will then receive water and be transported to the processing center. Anyone causing trouble will be disciplined. Anyone cooperating will be treated correctly. Understood?" Keller nodded almost instinctively. The tone was firm, not cruel. It was simply matter-of-fact. He found himself taking orders from the enemy, a thought that made him uneasy. The search was thorough but not humiliating. Personal effects, letters, and photographs were catalogued carefully. No one's possessions were stolen or destroyed. The wounded were separated for immediate medical attention. There was no violence, no screaming, only calm efficiency. Then came water. British soldiers moved down the lines with canteens, offering drinks to men who had spent the past weeks trying to kill them. Keller took the cold water, his hands trembling slightly. And then one of the soldiers handed him a tin mug. "Sorry about the wait," he said almost politely. "There's tea at the camp." Keller stared at the mug in disbelief. He had been trained to expect monsters, to see cruelty everywhere, and yet here he was, being handed a cup of tea by the very people he had been told would torture him. His mind struggled to process this. The enemy had become civilized. This moment was not just confusing, it was a shock to the very foundation of his beliefs. 4 years, Keller had been taught that the British were ruthless, merciless creatures, and that capture would mean suffering beyond imagination. Now he was met with order, discipline, and small acts of kindness. A simple cup of tea was a psychological bomb. It bypassed his training, shook his faith in Nazi propaganda, and planted a tiny seed of doubt. What if everything he had been taught about the enemy was wrong? The camp itself only deepened his confusion. Wooden barracks were arranged neatly, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. The rain dripped steadily onto the orderly grounds. Inside, the atmosphere was efficient, almost clinical. Documentation was completed in German. Medical examinations were thorough, professional, and impartial. The wounded received care without discrimination. Nothing was cruel. Nothing was improvised. Everything was calculated, precise, and systematic. Keller's first meal at Camp 174 would only add to his disbelief. He expected watery soup, dry bread, rations barely enough to survive. Instead, he was served a thick stew with real meat, boiled potatoes, fresh bread, and of course tea. Other prisoners ate in stunned silence. Some stared at the food as if it were a miracle. Others ate slowly, afraid it might be a trick. Some quietly wept, not from sadness but from relief. For the first time in weeks they were warm, fed, and safe. The psychological impact was immense. Keller and his fellow soldiers had entered this camp expecting cruelty and punishment. They were ready for the horrors they had been promised. Instead, they were met with routine, order, and decency. It was a lesson far more powerful than any weapon on the battlefield. As he finished his meal, Keller could not shake the questions forming in his mind. If the enemy treated them this way, what did it say about everything he had been told? What did it mean for the propaganda he had believed for so long? The British were not monsters. They were human. They were organized, efficient, and yes, even kind. The contrast to the chaos and brutality of the war front was so sharp that it left him disoriented. As night fell on his first day in captivity, Keller lay on a simple bed in a wooden barack. He stared at the ceiling, the events of the day running through his mind. A cup of tea, a warm meal, orderly lines, and fair treatment. These were the things that would haunt him far more than any battle he had fought. The war had trained him to expect terror, yet he found himself terrified of the truth instead. The enemy was not what he had been told. And so the stage was set. For 400,000 German POWs, Britain was a land of confusion, a place where hatred met discipline and fear collided with civility. One cup of tea had begun to crack the foundations of 4 years of indoctrination. Closing hook for next part. Could a cup of tea really shatter 4 years of propaganda? What comes next will challenge everything these men believed. When Martin Keller woke the next morning, the drizzle was still falling softly over the camp. The first day had left him stunned, and he could barely process what had happened. A cup of tea, a hot meal, and fair treatment. These were things he had never imagined could exist at the hands of an enemy. But today he would begin to see that this was not an accident, nor the kindness of a single soldier. This was a system, and it was deliberate. Britain had prepared for the arrival of hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Over 400,000 Axis soldiers would be captured and held across the country, from the rocky coasts of Cornwall to the highlands of Scotland. More than 600 facilities, known as P camps, had been constructed. Each camp was a carefully organized compound of wooden barracks, barbed wire, and watchtowers, designed to house anywhere from 500 to 5,000 men. Nothing was left to chance. Every detail was planned with one clear purpose: to manage the enemy through order, discipline, and decency. The British War Office had issued strict instructions. Prisoners would be treated according to the 1929 Geneva Conventions. They would be fed properly, housed adequately, worked within legal limits, and disciplined fairly. There would be no cruelty, no favoritism, no arbitrary abuse. At first, this seemed almost too good to be true for Keller and his comrades. They had been trained to expect pain, fear, and humiliation. Yet now they were learning a shocking truth: civilization could exist even in wartime. The system had 4 key objectives. First, security. The British had learned that well-treated prisoners were easier to manage. Men who were fed, clothed, and treated fairly were less likely to riot, resist, or attempt escape. Second, intelligence. Prisoners who were treated humanely were far more willing to talk. A cigarette, a kind word, or a question about home could yield far more information than threats or violence ever could. Third, diplomacy. Each German prisoner in Britain was a bargaining chip. Their treatment ensured that British prisoners in German hands would be treated similarly. And fourth, morality. Britain wanted to demonstrate that fighting for civilization meant more than defeating an enemy; it meant maintaining humanity even under extreme pressure. Keller watched as these principles were applied in Camp 174. The guards moved with calm precision. Each order was clear, each task efficiently executed. Medical care was professional and impartial. The wounded received attention immediately, and the sick were not left to suffer. Everything was fair, everything was organized. For Keller, this was unsettling. He had been taught that enemies should be brutal, ruthless, and unfeeling. Here, order and decency were weapons far more powerful than guns or tanks. Breakfast that morning was another shock. He had expected dry bread and thin soup. Instead, he was served thick oatmeal, fresh bread, butter, and again tea. He watched his fellow prisoners react in stunned silence. Some ate slowly as if afraid the food might disappear. Others stared at the simple meal in disbelief. For weeks they had lived with hunger and fear. Now they were fed and treated as human beings. Keller felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The psychological impact was immediate. Prisoners had been told for years that the British were monsters, cruel and unforgiving. Now they were learning that the opposite was true. This decency was not just polite behavior, it was systematic. Every detail, from the cleanliness of the barracks to the timing of meals and tea breaks, was carefully planned. The British were demonstrating control, strength, and intelligence in a way that forced prisoners to rethink everything they had been taught. Even the guards' attitude reinforced this lesson. They were firm but not cruel. Orders were enforced consistently, and violations of rules were punished fairly, usually with confinement or reduced privileges rather than violence. The barbed wire itself, not the soldiers, maintained discipline. This contrast to the brutality of the Eastern Front or the propaganda Keller had absorbed left the prisoners disoriented. They had expected monsters and found instead organization, fairness, and civility. Over time, Keller began to see the larger purpose. Every detail of the camp, from the orderly lines to the regular meals, was designed to challenge the Nazi belief that the enemy was barbaric. It was psychological warfare, silent and deliberate. By showing that decency could exist even in war, Britain was dismantling the ideology that had kept its soldiers loyal for years. Keller could not yet fully understand the consequences, but he sensed the cracks forming in his own beliefs. By the end of his second day, the lesson was clear. Britain's system of decency was not weakness. It was strength. It was calculated, effective, and unshakable. And for Keller and thousands like him, it planted the first seed of doubt that would grow into something far more profound. A realization that their world had been built on lies. Closing hook for next part. A cup of tea had begun to shatter propaganda, but the real test was yet to come. Out in the fields, face to face with civilians, the prisoners would discover the full power of British decency, and its ability to change hearts. Days turned into weeks for Martin Keller at Camp 174, yet each day brought new surprises that left him questioning everything he had ever believed. He had expected hatred, cruelty, and punishment from the British. Instead, he was met with something entirely unexpected: human kindness. Not random gestures, not the actions of a single soldier, but a systematic, deliberate effort to treat prisoners with fairness and respect. It began with the way orders were given. The guards were firm but never cruel. When prisoners violated rules, they were disciplined, yes, but never beaten. Keller observed closely as even the smallest infractions were addressed calmly, without anger or malice. There was no shouting, no humiliation, no personal vendettas. The British officers maintained an almost clinical neutrality, enforcing rules with precision. It was as if discipline itself had replaced cruelty as the tool of control. Keller began to notice a subtle but powerful pattern. Every act of decency, every fair treatment, was part of a larger psychological strategy. Britain was showing that civility could coexist with strength. The prisoners were allowed to keep personal belongings, letters, and photographs, and these were carefully catalogued rather than destroyed. Medical care was given without discrimination. The wounded received immediate attention, and the sick were treated with the same professionalism as British soldiers. Every small gesture carried weight. One morning, Keller was handed clean clothes after a thorough inspection. A blanket was provided, carefully folded and warm. Meals were served punctually, each one filling and nutritious. And always there was tea. A simple tin mug of warm tea became a symbol of something far greater than refreshment. It was proof that the enemy could be trusted to act humanely even in war. The psychological effect on the prisoners was profound. Many had been taught that the British were monsters who would torture them at the first opportunity. Now, Keller and others were experiencing calm, decency, and predictable routine. Their minds, trained for violence and suspicion, struggled to reconcile the reality before them with years of propaganda. Confusion gave way to unease. Unease gave way to doubt. One day, Keller witnessed a scene that drove the point home. A wounded prisoner was carried into the medical tent. British doctors moved swiftly, efficiently, and with complete professionalism. No words of anger, no punishment, no insult. The prisoner received the care he needed. Keller realized something shocking. He had been taught that enemies were defined by cruelty, yet here, mercy and competence coexisted with power. Even outside the barracks, the rules of decency held firm. Prisoners were assigned tasks and work details, and the British officers ensured fairness in assignments. Tasks were explained clearly, tools were provided, and work was monitored with consistency. Laziness or deliberate disobedience was punished, but always in a measured way, never with physical harm. The prisoners could not help but notice the stark contrast to the chaos and brutality of the battlefront, where commands were shouted, and punishment was often immediate and cruel. Keller began to talk to other prisoners. Slowly, conversations turned from complaints about food or beds to deeper reflections. Some admitted their surprise, whispering about how wrong their propaganda had been. "They are not monsters," one man said quietly. "They treat us like humans." The words felt dangerous, almost forbidden, because accepting them meant questioning everything they had been taught to believe about the enemy and the war itself. This growing cognitive dissonance was the real shock. Keller's mind was being challenged not by guns or tanks, but by the quiet, deliberate decency of his captors. Every polite command, every fair inspection, every simple meal reinforced a single idea: the British were not what he had been trained to expect. Their power did not come from cruelty, but from the strength to be civilized under pressure. By the end of the week, Keller found himself thinking about small, seemingly insignificant moments. A nod from a sergeant, a cup of tea during a break, the way a guard patiently explained rules. These moments accumulated like invisible cracks in the structure of his beliefs. He had been told for years that cruelty defined the British, yet here they were showing him, systematically day after day, that strength and kindness could coexist. The prisoners' confusion grew into fear, not of physical harm but of the truth. If the enemy was not what they had been taught, what else might be false? What other lies had they been fed? Keller began to realize that he was being forced to think, to reflect, and to face uncomfortable truths about the war he had fought for. This was the power of the British system of decency. It did not merely feed prisoners or provide shelter. It attacked the ideology of hatred and fear with calm, deliberate efficiency. 4 men trained to kill, who had believed in brutality as the measure of strength, this was far more devastating than any battle they had fought. And so, the stage was set for the next phase of Keller's journey. The camps were only the beginning. Beyond the barbed wire, prisoners would soon encounter civilians, people who had suffered losses and endured hardships themselves. These encounters would test not only the prisoners' expectations but the very core of their beliefs about humanity, war, and morality. After weeks inside Camp 174, Martin Keller and his fellow prisoners began to adjust to the rhythm of life under British captivity. They had grown accustomed to orderly routines, fair treatment, and meals served with polite words instead of cruelty. Yet nothing could have prepared them for what came next. They were about to leave the protective boundaries of the camp and step into the wider world. A world where the enemy they had been trained to fear awaited in the form of ordinary civilians. Keller was assigned to a small farm in Kent, a picturesque village surrounded by rolling green fields. He expected hostility. He imagined farmers glaring at them with hatred, ready to punish them for the war, for the bombing of their cities, for the deaths of their sons and husbands. Every step out of the truck made his stomach tighten. His mind raced with the warnings he had absorbed over years of propaganda. Civilians were angry, merciless, and would take revenge if given the chance. Instead, they were met by Robert Harrison, the farm's owner. Harrison was an older man, his face lined with years of sun and grief. His only son had been killed at Dunkirk 4 years earlier. Keller's heart sank. This man had every reason to despise him, every reason to act cruelly. And yet Harrison's first words were calm and measured: "Work hard. Do it properly. Treat the animals and the crops with care. I will treat you fairly if you treat me fairly." The prisoners began their work. It was hard and unfamiliar. Keller, once a bank clerk, had no experience with farming. He struggled with the tools, the animals, and the long hours. Yet Harrison and his assistants guided them patiently. Mistakes were corrected firmly but without anger. Laziness was not tolerated, but punishment meant instruction, not violence. Slowly, Keller realized that the fairness and consistency he had seen in the camp had followed him here. Even more surprising were the small gestures of kindness. During breaks, Harrison brought out tea for the prisoners, poured it carefully, and handed it to them without fanfare. The cups were small, the tea strong, but the gesture was enormous. For Keller, it was another blow to the beliefs he had held for years. He had been taught that the British were cruel, that they would see him as subhuman. Yet here they were, offering warmth and sustenance, as if he were a valued worker rather than a defeated enemy. Other farmers acted similarly. Prisoners were sent to farms across England, Scotland, and Wales. Everywhere they went, they encountered the same pattern: firm expectations, clear rules, fair treatment, and small acts of kindness. Cigarettes were shared during breaks. Meals were generous, often more than the prisoners had eaten in months. And always there was tea. A simple, ordinary ritual had become the symbol of British decency. The psychological impact on Keller and others was profound. Many of the soldiers had been taught to hate civilians as much as the army. But here they saw patience, fairness, and professionalism. Even farmers who had lost sons to the war treated the prisoners with dignity. It was deeply confusing, almost unbearable. How could someone whose child had died at the hands of the German army extend kindness to the very men responsible? As the days passed, Keller noticed changes within himself. Conversations with other prisoners turned from complaints about the work or weather to deeper reflections. Some admitted quietly that the propaganda they had believed was a lie. "They are human," one whispered. "They are not monsters." These words were dangerous, not in the sense of punishment but because admitting them meant confronting the truth of the war and the ideology that had guided their lives. The prisoners also began learning English, not from formal lessons, but through daily interactions with civilians. Simple words, instructions, and casual conversations slowly opened a window to a world they had been taught did not exist. This small cultural exchange, combined with fair treatment, began to erode the foundations of their beliefs. For Keller, the most difficult part was reconciling the kindness with the reality of his actions. He had fought for the Third Reich, participated in a war built on hatred and caused suffering. Yet here he was being treated with respect and dignity. Each cup of tea, each calm instruction, each patient correction was a mirror reflecting the contrast between his world and the world he had been taught to expect. And so, the farm became a battleground of a different kind, a battle for the mind, for the beliefs, for the conscience. The physical labor was demanding, but the psychological work was even harder. Keller had to confront the possibility that the enemy he feared, the people he was taught to hate, might in fact represent the kind of humanity he had never known. As the sun set over the fields, Keller paused to look around. The green hills, the orderly farm, the quiet discipline, and the simple gestures of kindness, all of it contradicted the lessons he had been taught. For the first time he began to ask a question that would haunt him for months. If the enemy could be so civilized, if kindness could coexist with strength, what did that mean for the world he had fought for? Winter had arrived at Camp 174, and the chill in the air was sharper than any prisoner had expected. The drizzle and frost painted a gray, quiet landscape, but inside the barracks, something unusual was stirring. Christmas was approaching, and with it, a test far more profound than any drill, inspection, or cup of tea. For the prisoners, the holiday would bring not gifts or feasts, but an encounter with humanity itself, an encounter that would shake their beliefs to the core. Martin Keller had grown accustomed to the calm efficiency of the British camps and the quiet decency of the farmers. Yet Christmas presented something entirely new. The camp authorities, following the Geneva Conventions, permitted the prisoners to organize their own Christmas services. They could celebrate their faith, whether Protestant or Catholic, in whatever way they chose. It was not a concession. It was a rule, a formal acknowledgement of their rights even as defeated enemies. The prisoners set to work. Using scraps of tin, paper, and whatever materials they could find, they decorated the barracks. They arranged makeshift ornaments, hung simple decorations, and prepared for services that were as much about hope as they were about religion. Keller watched quietly as men who had spent years steeped in hatred and fear worked side by side, preparing to celebrate a holiday for the first time in captivity. On Christmas Eve, the Protestant prisoners gathered in the hall. They sang Silent Night in German, their voices soft, hesitant at first, then stronger as the song progressed. The sound floated across the camp square, reaching the ears of the British guards in the towers. The men in uniform, far from their own families, paused. They listened. Some stood silently, others nodded in quiet acknowledgement. None interfered. None mocked. Then came an unexpected moment. Sergeant Major William Thompson, the man who had processed Keller on the first day in camp, entered the hall carrying a box. The prisoners tensed instinctively, expecting punishment, inspection, or at least stern words. Instead, Thompson quietly placed the box on a table and opened it. Inside were cigarettes, biscuits, and small treats from the camp store. He spoke simply, with no ceremony, no grand speech. "Happy Christmas, lads." The room fell silent. Keller could hardly believe what he was witnessing. The enemy, the very people he had been trained to hate, were treating him not only with fairness but with generosity and respect. They could have mocked the prisoners, forbidden the service, or simply ignored it. Instead, they chose acknowledgement, humanity, and dignity. This act had a profound psychological effect. For years, Keller had been told that the British were monsters, capable of cruelty without thought. Now he realized that their strength lay not in punishment or intimidation, but in restraint, fairness, and moral courage. The prisoners, many of whom had lost faith in humanity entirely, felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar: confusion, awe, and even gratitude. Letters written during this period became another tool of subtle transformation. The British allowed prisoners to write home, under careful censorship. Keller and others penned words of honesty, describing their treatment: proper meals, clean beds, fair supervision, and yes, the daily ritual of tea. These letters, when they reached families in Germany, carried a message that shook Nazi propaganda to its foundations. Families braced for tales of brutality, but instead found accounts of decency. A son described a Christmas service in a camp thousands of miles away, where he was treated with respect by men he had been told were monsters. The ripple effect was extraordinary. German civilians, enduring rationing, bombings, and fear, read these letters with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The carefully constructed narrative of the Nazi regime, that the British were barbaric and cruel, began to crumble, not through speeches or propaganda broadcasts, but through the honest words of prisoners describing simple acts of humanity. For Keller, the Christmas service was more than a moment of respite. It was a turning point. He had entered the camp prepared to hate, trained to expect brutality, and ready to be broken. Instead, he encountered restraint, fairness, and a quiet recognition of his humanity. Each element, the decorations, the singing, the quiet applause, and the sergeant major's gift, was a lesson in the moral strength of the British system. Keller realized that the war he had fought was not a battle of strength alone, but a battle of values. The British had not only defeated him militarily, they had challenged the very ideology he had been taught to defend. The difference was subtle yet undeniable. Brutality could destroy bodies, but decency could transform minds. That Christmas, Keller understood that the lessons of captivity would follow him long after the war ended. It was not the bullets, the barbed wire, or even the enforced labor that left the deepest mark. It was the deliberate, persistent, and undeniable humanity of the captors. For the first time, Keller felt the dissonance of living in a world where the enemy could show more morality than the regime he had served for years. Closing hook for next part. The prisoners had seen civility in the camps and kindness on the farms, but the ultimate challenge was still ahead, facing the truth of the world outside the barbed wire, and confronting the consequences of the war they had fought. What they would discover next would shake their beliefs even further. By early 1945, Martin Keller had spent months in British captivity, and his understanding of the war, the enemy, and himself had begun to shift. Life in the camps and work on the farms had already challenged everything he had been taught, but the real transformation was only beginning. Beyond the routines, meals, and tea, the British had a more deliberate plan: to educate the prisoners, to confront them with the truth, and to dismantle the ideological chains of the Nazi regime. Keller had long suspected that the propaganda he had absorbed was flawed, but it wasn't until he saw British newspapers and official information that he truly began to understand the scale of the deception. These papers, carefully censored for security, allowed prisoners to see the progress of the war, debates within democratic governments, and the human consequences of the Nazi policies at home and abroad. For the first time, he saw the truth about the regime he had served. The British authorities also organized formal re-education programs. These were not lectures of moralizing or forced indoctrination. They were structured, educational, and factual. Prisoners were shown films from liberated concentration camps, and the shocking reality of Nazi atrocities was made undeniable. Keller sat silently, stunned by what he saw. Entire populations starved, tortured, and killed. The regime he had believed in, the system he had fought for, was a criminal enterprise. Discussions followed these lessons. Prisoners could ask questions, debate, and express confusion or disbelief. The British facilitators did not respond with anger or condemnation. Instead, they guided prisoners through careful reasoning, showing how ideology had been manipulated to justify brutality in war. This methodical approach forced Keller and others to confront the uncomfortable truth. Their loyalty, their training, and their beliefs had been built on lies. Letters sent home became a crucial part of this transformation. Keller wrote with honesty, detailing his experiences: the meals, the medical care, the humane treatment, and the moral consistency of his captors. German families, many enduring bombings, rationing, and personal loss, received these letters with a mix of relief and incredulity. They had been taught that the British were monsters, but now they were reading first-hand accounts of decency, fairness, and humanity. The letters did more than reassure families; they undermined Nazi propaganda. Each description of clean beds, sufficient food, and calm, disciplined guards chipped away at the carefully constructed image of the enemy. Keller's words became a quiet weapon against the ideology he had once defended. For the German soldiers still fighting at the front, these accounts offered a new calculus. Surrender no longer meant death, starvation, or torture. It meant survival and humane treatment. The psychological impact on prisoners like Keller was profound. Years of fanatical indoctrination had created soldiers who believed in racial superiority and absolute obedience. Now they were being forced to reconcile the decency of their captors with the lies they had been fed. Every fair interaction, every letter allowed home, and every piece of factual education became a hammer striking at the foundations of Nazi ideology. Keller began to see himself and his comrades in a new light. The anger, fear, and hatred that had fueled him during the war were gradually replaced by reflection, humility, and even guilt. He realized that the war had not just been fought with weapons, it had been fought with ideas, lies, and manipulation. And the British, through their consistent decency, had begun to undo those lies, one small act at a time. This transformation was not uniform. Some prisoners remained unyielding, clinging to old beliefs, viewing kindness as weakness, and refusing to question the ideology they had followed. Others, like Keller, slowly rebuilt their understanding of the world. They began to comprehend the value of democracy, the importance of human dignity, and the consequences of fanaticism. They learned that power was not measured by cruelty, but by the ability to maintain humanity even in victory. By the time spring arrived in 1945, Keller felt a profound shift within himself. He had entered the camp as a soldier of the Third Reich, trained to hate, ready to kill, and expecting the worst from his captors. Now he had a growing awareness that the enemy had treated him not as a subhuman, but as a human being. Every cup of tea, every fair meal, every educational lesson, and every letter sent home had contributed to a transformation that was psychological, moral, and emotional. The British system of decency had not only prevented disorder in the camps, but it had created allies where there had been enemies. Prisoners were beginning to think critically, reflect honestly, and understand the consequences of their actions. The slow, deliberate strategy of humane treatment and education was more powerful than any weapon on the battlefield. Closing hook for next part. Keller's transformation was not yet complete. Even as the war ended, the question remained: would these former enemies return to Germany changed, or would they embrace the past they had been taught to honor? The final chapter would reveal the astonishing choices these men made after captivity. The war was finally over. Europe was in ruins, Germany devastated by years of conflict, and Britain faced the daunting task of rebuilding. For Martin Keller and thousands of other German prisoners, this marked a turning point. They were free to return home. Yet for many, including Keller, the end of the war did not bring relief. It brought difficult choices and profound reflection. Keller stood at the railway station in Lanarkshire, Scotland, the same station where he had arrived 3.5 years earlier as a terrified prisoner. The green hills he had walked past countless times now seemed different, familiar yet strange. He was no longer a soldier of the Third Reich, consumed by hatred and propaganda. He was a man who had experienced the unexpected, decency, fairness, and the quiet strength of those he had once considered enemies. The British government allowed prisoners to return home, but a surprising number chose to stay. Britain still faced a severe labor shortage. Factories, farms, and reconstruction projects required manpower. Approximately 25,000 former prisoners volunteered to remain, not as captives but as civilian workers. Keller was among them. He had no home to return to. Hamburg lay in rubble, his family scattered, his past destroyed. Britain offered him work, housing, and a chance to rebuild his life. Keller's time as a voluntary worker reflected the same principles he had seen during his captivity. He worked diligently, learning new skills and integrating into British society. He was treated fairly and with respect. There was no resentment, no lingering punishment. The British system had transformed not only his mind, but also his sense of possibility. He began to understand the full power of the strategy he had witnessed. Kindness and fairness could turn an enemy into a willing ally. During this period, Keller formed connections with the people he had once been taught to hate. Robert Harrison, the farmer who had first welcomed him to Kent, became a friend and mentor. The small gestures, cups of tea, guidance in work, words of encouragement, had built a bridge over years of indoctrination. Keller could not forget the Christmas service, the letters home, or the daily routines that had shattered his expectations. These memories guided him in his new life. Some former prisoners married British women, established businesses, and became citizens. They chose to remain because the decency they experienced in captivity had shown them an alternative to the ideology they had once followed. Keller, like many others, carried a quiet, profound respect for the country that had once held him as an enemy. Britain had not sought revenge, had not humiliated him, had not crushed him physically or morally. Instead, it had treated him as a human being capable of growth, learning, and change. As he prepared to finally return to Germany in 1948, Keller reflected on the journey that had begun with fear, suspicion, and indoctrination. He had arrived expecting punishment, expecting cruelty, and expecting to witness the harshest forms of war firsthand. Instead, he had been met with a system of decency so deliberate and consistent that it had changed him profoundly. He left Britain not broken but strengthened by the lessons he had learned, that true power lies not in cruelty but in restraint, that victory does not require vengeance, but can be achieved through moral courage, and that humanity can endure even in the darkest times. Keller took one last look at the railway station, at the fields he had worked, and at the people who had once been his enemies. Robert Harrison approached, carrying a small package. Inside were tea, biscuits, and a personal letter of reference. "You are a good worker," Harrison said. "If Germany doesn't treat you right, you are welcome back here. We will find you something." Keller nodded, unable to speak. He realized that the cup of tea he had received on his first day in Britain had been more than a drink. It had been a symbol of trust, humanity, and the power of decency. The train pulled away. Keller watched the English countryside pass by, the memory of fairness, kindness, and quiet strength etched into his mind. He would return to a shattered Germany, but he carried with him a new understanding of civilization, morality, and the strength it takes to be humane. Years later, he would tell his children about Britain, not about cruelty or vengeance but about tea, fairness, and the quiet dignity of those who knew how to wield strength with restraint. The story of Martin Keller and the 400,000 German prisoners was not only about captivity or war. It was about the power of decency to reshape minds, transform enemies into allies, and build a foundation for a lasting peace. The cups of tea, the fair meals, the humane treatment, and the respect for human dignity had done what weapons could not. They had won hearts, rebuilt lives, and left a legacy that endured far beyond the barbed wire. Final closing hook. From fear and hatred to understanding and respect, the journey of these prisoners shows us a truth that echoes through history. Sometimes the greatest victories are not won on the battlefield, but in the quiet, unyielding strength of decency.